Here we go. I'm back in plenary session, joined via Zoom by Samantha Godwin. Samantha Godwin is resident fellow at the Yale Law School. She's a philosopher, she's a lawyer, and we're going to be talking about SARS-CoV-2 policy. Samantha Godwin, it's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to speak to you, Vinay.
Thanks. I've been following your stuff with interest, and I really appreciated your point of view, and we had a conversation before. So I wonder if before we start, maybe it will be helpful for the listeners and maybe for me to go over your background. I was asking you a little bit before this podcast. You are somebody who has a background that includes philosophy and law. You did your undergraduate degree at University College London. You went on to do your JD from Georgetown University. And then you've spent time at the Yale Law School. I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about your background. Is your interest philosophy, law, both? How did you fall into this path?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think there were pragmatic considerations that led me from philosophy to law, and now sort of act way that I can make it relevant to legal and political questions that have more real world implications than I think I could probably do in just a pure philosophy academic trajectory. So I do I do both, but I do law that's informed by analytic philosophy, or at least that's what I try to do.
Well, these days, both of these fields, I think, are deeply relevant to where we find ourselves. I often note you are a commenter on dialogues about SARS-CoV-2 and our policy around it. Maybe I'll start by picking your brain about the issue that got me all riled up recently, and I think you saw it a little bit, which is the use of Facebook having independent fact checkers fact check opinion articles, and if deemed misleading, down throttle them, which means I think that fewer people will visually see it. They will be stamped as misleading. You're somebody who lives a life of ideas, of the war of ideas, of different ways of conceptualizing issues. You defend those issues at length in your publications. What are your thoughts on this role, unique role, unprecedented, that a single social media platform is viewed by so many people, and that a process can be instituted that we can decide, you can tell us what you think of the process, to restrict or down throttle information?
Yeah, well, I think I agree with some statements I've seen by you on YouTube that Facebook and Twitter operate as unique information intermediaries, where they have the type of monopoly power that that government censors might have enjoyed in previous eras, yeah. But that given the amount of people who get their news exclusively from Facebook and Twitter, or who at least have their opinions about what counts as credible, what counts as the shared received opinion, what counts as the expert consensus formed through the way those platforms present information to them. It's not just that it's dangerous in a sort of epistemic sense, that it prevents people from being able to formulate an understanding of what's going on outside of the particular filter that Twitter and Facebook and their selective fact-checking that in a previous YouTube video and in an op-ed, I think you got very effectively into by labeling content as, I forget the exact term they use on Facebook, but
Misleading.
you label it misleading. And so when you have the official stamp, as you rightly noted, you can't share that without already introducing it as not something that others ought to consider seriously, something that they ought to shelve in the same category as a conspiracy theory, even if it's something that's both. I mean, there's a so the epistemic danger is that people don't know what's going on except through this extremely filtered lens through these corporate monopolies that apparently have very strong political preferences. Maybe they have strong political preferences for profit motivated reasons, and like we can talk about why that might be the case. And these are not partisan political preferences exactly. They're more like political preferences in favor of whatever is most likely to lead to the type of fear responses, outrage responses, and contempt responses that I think really drive social media engagement and drive traditional online media engagement and therefore ad revenue. But nonetheless, even though they're profit motivated, there are still political lines on the most important social questions, the social questions that have entirely reorganized society recently around SARS-CoV-2. So I think that the impact on people's ability to form their own understanding of the world is terrifying. And then, of course, the political implication is terrifying because when when the informational environment that someone's in is calibrated to tune their understanding of events to the maximum terror, of course, that's going to lead to disproportionate responses, lead to responses that are driven by not fear that's irrational in the sense that it isn't prompted by something that's truly dangerous and truly dreadful, which I think we all agree that COVID-19 is, but rather fear that's directed in a way that that is both counterproductive to alleviating the source of the danger and counterproductive to living in a humane society. So I think we've really seen the suppression of countervailing considerations of values other than COVID-19 mitigation.
Yeah, it's going to lead to, yeah. Now that's where I was going to go with, because I was looking at your paper and that was what I was going to ask you. But, you know, I think you put that nicely where, I mean, the word that jumped out at me is, you know, you describe it as even terrifying. I was talking to a colleague about this information issue, which is this unprecedented power. I mean, so many hundreds of millions of people are getting their information through this platform, and the platform has a throttle switch that they can turn down and say, this idea, even if the users deem it correct, it is not correct, and we will down regulate that. And that to me is, I said that if we are in a war of ideas, and I'm happy to fight that war, This is a nuclear weapon. It's a chemical weapon. It's a type of warfare that I'm not familiar with. The typical warfare of reason and argument is the warfare I'm familiar with. But the question I wanted to ask you was related to your, draft paper that you're working on, which you have entitled Proportionality in Pandemics and the Asymmetric Mental Health Harms of Isolation. That's the subtitle. The other title you offer is Caring About More Than One Health Crisis at Once. I wonder if you might unpack this a little bit. I think it's, the title and what I read about it, strikes me as something, a deeply profound observation, which is the way in which our mind weighs and anchors onto different health threats when really we're all in the same business, maximizing human health in all dimensions, from number of times your heart beats to the quality of your life, your mental health, your social health. And we're facing trade-offs and choices. And yet, to some degree, the media narrative, the Twitter narrative becomes skewed. I wonder if you might walk us through your thinking on this issue. It's a very important issue.
Sure. I think, as you know, the sources of morbidity and mortality that are most likely to have harm the most people and cause the most death, or not the sources of morbidity and mortality that people are most afraid of, not just post COVID-19, but pre-COVID-19. Heart disease, for instance, has never rated as a very highly charged fear factor in either the media or public discourse, or what, for instance, people Google on Google statistics, as compared to types of cancers that kill, to the number of people who die from cardiovascular disease. We have had an intense fear of airplane terrorism since 2001, which I think has, been, now that's not what people are afraid of, going onto airplanes anymore, I guess. But that, of course, was in extraordinary disproportion to the, say, danger that you would encounter if you drove a car the same distance that you would have otherwise taken an airplane. So we I think, have a very poor baseline ability to assess risk to our life and health, and to that of those we care about. So we're also, the gap between, say, the number of actual child abductions by non-parents and the amount of fear around child abduction by non-parents, and the degree to which people try to structure their kids' lives around it, is enormous, right? But I think one of the sort of uniquely disturbing things is that I think we've gotten into something like a totalizing zero risk bias with regard to COVID-19, meaning that in general, people are predisposed to wanting to eliminate in total certain identifiable risks over the aggregate reduction of risk. If they, I think Daniel Kahneman has some work on this that seems to show that it's a fairly wide, it's a phenomenon you can produce with risks that aren't necessarily as media charged as COVID-19. But with COVID-19, it's as though all of the damage from efforts at mitigation gets completely ignored, except insofar as that damage might itself be mitigated by means that don't even have the hypothetical potential to marginally reduce the efficacy of COVID-19 mitigation efforts. So when you see articles on the mental health crisis of COVID-19 driven isolation, often for children, given the school shutdowns, but for adults who live by themselves, for instance, or the parents who have built their lives around the expectation that they'd be able to have their kids in school rather than having to perform this impossible task of simultaneously educating their kids and working from home. You have the tendency is not to think, well, okay, how can we balance these two harms such that maybe the marginal added benefit to COVID-19 reduction from say telling people they should never meet inside with people from other households during the pandemic, which, okay, that's maybe fine during the summer, but during the winter, this effectively means you're not meeting people during the pandemic. What's the marginal, the marginal benefit of that? It isn't considered against to say, well, meet inside, but under, say, ventilated conditions, or only people who are very low risk, or if at least if you both already, if one of you has already had COVID-19, or you've already had a COVID-19 vaccination, or perhaps are already fully vaccinated, well, of course, then you should go ahead and do that, because the marginal benefit of not doing that to COVID-19 mitigation is so minimal, but the benefit to
your well-being,
your mental health, but also I think to your potentially your medical health, given that I think social isolation is a very well established all-cause mortality factor, even apart from subjectively rated loneliness, I think. So instead of that type of analysis, which would make sense if we were thinking about this in a more rational way, but would, given the fact that COVID-19 is as devastating as it is to the population as a whole, devastating in a demographically restricted way, where we can really, where the actual risk of serious illness and death is hugely age moderated, such that some the type of universal prescriptions we're giving just don't make a lot of sense from a total harm reduction standpoint. But instead of thinking that way, we instead tell people, well, they should schedule more Zoom calls. They should, you know, go for walks or meditate or do all of the things that, like, yeah, I mean, that's great, but that's maybe your advice if this state of affairs lasted for months.
Yes.
That's not exactly going to alleviate the burdens of isolation over a 12 to 18 to however many months long this process is going to go. I mean, and that was back when we didn't have, I think, any reasonable expectation that we could have such effective vaccines so early.
Right.
People were thinking, people had adopted the same attitude when this looked like it was going to be at least a 2 to 5 year.
Yes. Right. No, I think that's a super, I mean, many things you said resonated with me, just a few that struck me. I mean, one, you acknowledge the very steep age gradient and how this virus is not nearly the same in young people versus older people. And that's a fact that I think has, it's easy to gloss over. I think a lot of people do gloss over it. One of the consequences of that fact is when you talk about kids and pulling them out of schools, the marginal impact you might be having on the pandemic is very small. In fact, some studies suggest there's no marginal benefit at all. The mental health crisis, child abuse crisis that you don't see because it's not being documented. That's what's being missed from the dialogue. I think the other point you made is that some of these things that are sustainable for a month, they won't last a year. And we're lucky that we're talking about a year rather than 2 or 5. Yeah, right. We're lucky we're even talking about a year. So I guess my question is, and on the flip side, we see what politicians are doing. Texas just removed all restrictions. My friend went out to dinner there recently, indoor dining. And it's easy to go on social media and see people condemn that as irresponsible. But what I think they're missing is, aren't people telling you that they are prioritizing the social interactions over even some increased risk of viral spread? They are doing so through their elected representatives and through their actions because they are partaking in these behaviors. So I guess I wonder, what is the ire about? Is it that people want politicians to enforce policies that are unpopular in those locales? Because I think that the Texas policy is telling you what Texas people want. And my understanding is that is in fact what Texas people want. They do not want further restrictions. They do not want mask mandates. Perhaps even the majority of them. That may result in some increased pandemic spread, but it may also result in them participating in more human interactions. The flip side is, who knows what it might result in. The caseload is falling. There's a huge amount of people that have already been infected, and vaccinations are being pushed out rather rapidly. So there's some uncertainty as to the penalty that they'll face. I mean, famously, Florida was thought to be facing a big penalty. It never really materialized. They've done quite well, despite the fact they've done very little to contain the virus. So I wonder, from a legal perspective, many of these choices are framed as science choices. This is what science says to do. But how do you view it? Who is making the choice? Who ought to make the choice? Who is actually making the choice? How do you think about that?
Well, I think you raise a bunch of distinct questions. So one question is, why is there so much social media ire about say Texas reopening or Florida reopening? Or earlier on I kept watching how social democratic Sweden was bashed by all of my social democratic friends for being marginally worse off in the pandemic than its other Nordic countries, as if Nordic is a demographic
That's what I
characteristic
said.
that
It's not even a fair comparison. Yeah,
any,
but always it's against Nordic
yeah,
countries. Like
right.
okay.
But right, it's like not. I mean, it's they had they've had throughout the pandemic entirely middling death rates and infection rates among European countries, and certainly far less so than the big, like, police enforced, military enforced, I think in Spain's case, lockdown countries in Europe. But nevertheless, they were the embarrassment, right? And that I think that's so why people responded so strongly to that is, I think, a really interesting psychological question, and one that I can really only speculate about. Then your, I think, distinct question of, well, who ought to be making these decisions? Is this a science decision or a political decision or maybe a democratic decision? I think is hard because in a lot of ways, although our we like to call we like to call we like the phrase liberal Western democracies when in a lot of ways our political systems aren't especially democratically responsive, and they're certainly not very participatory, and there can certainly be a very large spread between what people want politicians to do and what they actually do. Although, frankly, in the case of the pandemic, I'm not sure they would the same direction as, say, a more robust conception of democracy requiring not only popular control over the government, but an informational environment where people can form their views without having having the image of the world filtered to them in a manner likely to lead to really a really warped perception of reality. And so I think I think with regard to the Iowa, well, there's a lot of there's still a tremendous amount of fear, but since we have a really politically, I want to say a really hard partisan environment, at least since at least as long as I can remember. And I mean, frankly, I was part of it until the pandemic. I mean, I'm sure I've said really awful things about Trump supporters on social media, and was, you know, a very, like, not of the camp that we shouldn't try to persuade people that I think a lot of people got into. But I can understand the emotional appeal of partisanship when you think that the people from the other party are acting on values that are fundamentally inhumane. And I think that's what I would like to think, that when people say they think that Governor Abbott or Sweden or Florida or killing people. And they're doing this because it's a bit of a joke with Sweden, but I guess with Texas and Florida, because they're prioritizing the market economy over human lives. That's the way they seriously feel. But at the same time, it's a sort of selective ire in the sense that they you don't see you tend to see anger about the types of social restrictions that the people angry about them are able to bear. So if you have
Well put.
a secure professional managerial job that is not going to be threatened from the loss of a idea of your physical presence at a workplace. And if you're, say, able to school your kids in a tutored pod, the way I know a lot of people are doing, if they have the means to, or to send their kids to private school, which they are probably not broadcasting on social media, but obviously.
Exactly. But they tell me, yeah, privately.
Right. But and frankly, it's to tell people, well, you should just stay home and just interact with people in your family and household is a lot smaller of an ask if that means, okay, you're going to stay at a very comfortable location with access to the outdoors, with maybe a dog and your two older kids and your, I don't know, set of family and friends who you're in sufficiently inner circles with that you a rich social life, not the extravagant social life that you might have been able to have prior to the pandemic, but nonetheless, the type of social life that still provides your life with a lot of meaning, versus someone who's in, say, a studio apartment in Manhattan who is basically in a kind of a, a gentle type of solitary confinement where they only ever see people through screens. That's a radically different ask. And I think the one of the interventions that looks like it might have been quite promising was the individual case isolation strategy that places like Hong Kong pursued, where instead of, say, identifying SARS-CoV-2 positive people and sending them home to infect the rest of their household or nursing home, they would send people to central
Yes.
hotel quarantine.
Yes. About it, yeah.
And like that is in a lot of ways a lot more effective since, as you know, most respiratory infections are transmitted within households. So in a lot of ways, the people who suffer the least from the stay the F home motto, likewise contributes most statistically to transmission of SARS-CoV-2, since they're both more likely to be infected and more likely to spread it to someone else who they live with. But if we did individual case isolation, that would have sort of equalized the burden, so to speak. Maybe everyone who ended up getting infected would spend 2 weeks in potentially decent, potentially crappy hotel, depending on, I guess, local resources. But that no one expressed ire that Texas wasn't following the Hong Kong model, right?
Right.
They were
Well,
expressing
interesting. Yes,
they were
I see where
expressing
you're.
ire that,
I
yeah,
see where
that's
you're taking it. Yes, they express ire about the things that they can tolerate in their comfortable lives, but not ire for not doing things they could not tolerate, which were things that were done in Wuhan province. That's an excellent point. I mean,
exactly.
the things you said made me think about a few things that I'll just comment on briefly. One was your point about politicization about this whole process, and I guess I'm probably aligned with you, somebody on the political left, although I don't spend too much time talking about politics beyond my interest in drug approvals. But I would say that I thought in a number of ways, politics and SARS-CoV-2 policies became wed in ways that don't make sense to me and were not necessary. For instance, it's easy to say that Trump was bad because he refused to wear a mask on a few occasions, but there was a zealotry on the other side that mask became a symbol of purity on the left. And people were wearing masks outdoors. They're having 2-year-olds wear masks, settings where I think many of us legitimately wonder if they do anything. I mean, I'm happy to wonder that. Do anything when you're running 20 miles in a sea breeze, and yet people, posting selfies of the sort. And I think that actually deepens polarization, because if your Twitter feed is Trump's an idiot, here's a selfie of me running, Biden is great, Biden is great, public option healthcare, in the minds of third parties, they all become wedded, and you're polarizing it in a way that you don't even see. The other example that comes to my mind is hydroxychloroquine. I think many people were not that very interested in it. There are a few randomized trials ongoing. Trump said he loved it, so folks on his side gravitated. But then people don't remember what happened on the other side. People who hated Trump said it was a deadly. Your heart would just suddenly stop beating. And both of them actually made it harder to recruit for trials. One of the trialists would tell you that when people started drumming up the fears, the negatives, it also prevented us from answering a question. And so that was kind of a both directions problem I see. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you and kind of close by saying is the issue of masks that I know you've tweeted about, and you've pointed to this, which is, people can say whatever they wish to say, but I was alive in early March of 2020, and I listened to what the experts said. And you point this out. Not only did they say you ought not do this, they said it could theoretically increase your risk of acquiring the virus. 6 weeks later, they said the opposite. They moved. And I do not believe, and I will say that there is no substantive evidence that emerged in those 6 weeks that warrants a pivot of that dimension. That was not justified by medical evidence, in my opinion. It was justified by a subjective opinion of a lot of inconclusive evidence. And that was, the justification, which, I don't really have a strong objection to. I just saying, you should say it as it is. But when that happened, somebody pointed this out to me, that there's never been a situation where in 50 days you moved from don't do this, this is the guidance of the bland, to if you say don't do this, you're promoting disinformation. That's a fast move. The only thing faster was when I wrote that after vaccination you can hang out, have a dinner party, and they literally tweeted at me that I was promoting misinformation. Now 5 weeks later, the CDC says you can. So now it's, of course, the canon. But my question to you is about this kind of shifting. It's not surprising when there's uncertainty that there will be dramatic shifts in how people think about an issue. But how do you balance that with credibility? Because you can lose credibility if you told me it was going to increase my risk, and then 5 weeks later you said I'm an idiot for not doing it. I will lose credibility in you. How do you think about that issue?
Well, I think I think this is also a question that this is also could be broken into a bunch of discrete questions. It could be broken into the question about what's the socially and politically responsible way to do public health messaging, and it could also be broken into a question about what's the relationship between science and policy in like a political philosophy context, and what's the relationship between science and policy in the current political climate. And I think I think one of the really the frightening combination is in first losing the fact value distinction, losing the distinction between what questions are empirical questions, where research into the way the world works, the way, say, a virus is transmitted, and what environments increase and decrease transmission by what degrees. Research, which is, as you know, often extremely fraught with methodological problems, where you, say, have people using laboratory dummy representations and treating that as if it translates directly into real world settings, using I mean, we're not even talking about like the problem of using observational studies as opposed to randomized control trials, but instead
bioplausibility. Yeah, I agree with you. Some of these studies are terrible. I don't know why anyone is pretending otherwise. Yeah, but yeah, it's confusing the two. You're putting it right. Yes.
But then say assume they do all of the research in the most rigorous fashion possible, but say I don't think anyone. I think masks either wearing them or as source control as protection for other people. And as far as I can tell, the real world trials for personal protection in different contexts seems to have very mixed evidence. I think the Oxford Center for Evidence-Based Medicine has some good write-ups about this, but there just really aren't any source control real-world studies that I think have been very compelling. And please let me know.
I agree with your summary. I'm not going to say otherwise. That is my summary of the literature as well.
Right, but when you say that, okay, the question is not going to be the question of whether or not, say, masks should be mandated or school closures should be government policy. That's a question that we can determine by what, say, Anthony Fauci or whomever your favorite expert says needs to happen. And that's sort of the way it's phrased. It's phrased as we can't go outside the home without wearing a mask, or we can't send our kids to school, or we can't, it's just not possible at this point to meet people outside of your household in person. When none of these things are matters of physical impossibility. They're making these claims as if they are in effect stating policy preferences. I think people ought not to go outside without masks, or I think a government ought to mandate masks, or I think a government ought to close schools or ought to implement a stay-home order. but instead of phrasing it in what I think is the only sort of conceptually accurate way, as a judgment about what policies ought to be implemented, a judgment that you would have to defend by reasoned argument, as opposed to appeal to the professional authority of the person who has the facts. They instead state it as if it's a factual claim, when clearly it is not against the physical laws of nature to meet up with people during a pandemic, for instance. That's not a fact question. That's a value question or a policy question. But to do policy questions and fact questions, then the virologists no longer have a monopoly on the discussion. Then you have to have a broader democratic discourse
Yes.
about how we should think about the type of society we want to live in, and whether this way of dealing with a very real threat, but a threat that I don't think is astronomically, it is outside the bounds of the type of risks people are exposed to by, say, orders of magnitude. And I think if you look at, I think if you compare even the most concerning infection fatality ratio tables for AIDS to the actuarial life tables by the Social Security Administration, for instance, we're talking about threats that are we're talking about infection fatality ratios that are, say, within the scale of a person's annual hazard of death. So, hey, of course you want to, because that would mean basically doubling your annual likelihood of dying. But that's not the same thing as, say, thinking that this is not the 1918 Spanish flu. This is not the Black Death. This is something that we should be able to have, I think, a more a debate that admits for values other than just crushing the virus, a debate that admits for the other things that we care about.
I think, the way you put it is really astute to me. And I think that one of the things that was conflated here is that many of these things we did, and, a pure scientist wouldn't tell you what you ought to do. That's, of course, I think the broader discussion you allude to. But a pure scientist could tell you that if you did each of these things, this is what you would get. The relative risk reduction from a mask mandate is 7.2% reduction in SARS-CoV-2 transmission. From banning indoor dining is 12.2%. From banning this is this percent. From banning outdoor ice skating rinks is minus 4.2% because people will move indoors instead. So it'll actually be counterproductive. That's what a good scientist would be able to tell you. The problem is they don't know any of those numbers, and they're not. No one was committed to even trying to answer those numbers. There was nothing done to get any closer to answering any of those numbers for any single thing, to my knowledge. Maybe with one exception, which I think we'll have a cluster RCT out of the Guinea. We had that one Danish mask study, but underpowered. It looked for a big difference. That to me is a big missed opportunity, and one of the reasons that opportunity was missed is, I think, people who are well-intentioned think they already know the answer to questions they don't know the answer to. And that's also a problem, I think, around debating what people ought to do after they get vaccinated. I tried to make tables to say, like, if you flew, from, I would imagine you're out on the East Coast, I'm here on the West Coast. If you flew out here, if we were to do this in person, what would be the risk of that flight? I see sort of estimates in the 1 in 5,000 ballpark that, you would acquire SARS-CoV-2 if you were to do that. If you were vaccinated and I was vaccinated and we met in the same room together, what's the risk that anybody, not just you or I or any third party, would get SARS-CoV-2 as a result of that? I did it some back of the envelope. I think it's on the order of 1 in 10 to the power of 6 or 1 in 10 to the power of 7, to put it in comparison. So when we're making these choices of what one ought to do, we need some relative sense of what the, as you put it, what the benefit will be. But we weren't really committed to answering those questions. And when you don't answer those questions, that kind of slip of language happens often because you don't really know what it's going to do, but you just know people ought to do it because it's probably beneficial. And you take a conversation that really needs to be the scientists focusing on the science and the policy people debating whether or not it's worth it and the trade-offs, to something where the scientist usurps the power, I believe, makes that choice for everybody, and to some degree precludes you from ever knowing the answer. I think there are some people who will have precluded us from studying some of these things because of their ardent, passionate rhetoric that exceeded, I think, known evidence. Anyway, I know our time is almost up. I'm going to give you the last word, and then I'm not going to say anything. I want to thank you for doing this. I think it's really interesting to me. And I've been a big supporter in interdisciplinary discussions around this, and I think we haven't done enough of that. I'll give you the last word. I know our time is up in a couple of minutes, so yeah, thank you for doing this. And I don't know, what does that make you think about?
Oh, well, hey, thank you so much for having me on. And I guess to conclude by responding to the I think also very astute analysis that you just offered. I think one of the really worrisome elements is that it's not just that we don't know the marginal risk reduction or the marginal risk increase that the different non-pharmaceutical interventions targeted. I get a very clear impression that the people who the scientists who are, as you said, usurping the policy debate and treating it as if it's a debate about facts rather than choices. One of the I think the values motto that we got early on was one of the scarier bits of public messaging. It's not just that they don't know, it's that they don't think the specific question is that important. They don't think the numbers are that important because they think instead we should apply a precautionary principle to all of these questions. Well, maybe wearing masks outdoors in a park only has a minuscule reduction, but since it doesn't cost us anything, we just have we just say we can't do it. But I think to conclude, I'd just like to offer that the amount of misery from social deprivation and from losing the ability to interact and connect to people on an emotionally meaningful level, which I do think often means having to meet in person. I don't think we can go for a year without doing that in a humane society, or the 2 or 3 years it looked like we were likely to. That's not the precaution toward the sort of like the maximum caution towards COVID-19 means a lack of any caution towards all of the collateral effects and all of the forms of harm that the non-pharmaceutical interventions targeting COVID can cause. So I would I would like to, I think maybe interdisciplinarity is what we need, because we need to get away from the idea that COVID is the only thing that matters when it comes to making decisions about how to organize our lives, and about how that that the it's like we've become a form of limited negative utilitarians, where the single utility function, the single measure of well-being is how little COVID-19 there is. And that, I think, clearly doesn't align with what anyone actually values. So we should stop acting as if it does. So anyways, thanks you so much for having me on.
That's very well said. Thank you, Samantha Godwin.